technically retired 20 years ago. I was 85 on Sunday. But they keep having me back in two departments. One is psych, where I teach Psych 204 called Justice, Race, and Class. And then politics puts on a paper that is also for the PPE and philosophy students called Group Society in the Market. So I'm about 2/3 of the way. I teach them both the first semester to have leisure the rest of the year.
Fair enough.
It's been about a 20-year stint since my so-called retirement.
So keep busy.
Well, I put on the blackboard a brief outline. I think one of the sad things is that universities, after all, are supposed to be the place beyond any other place where free speech should flourish, where people would challenge ideas in an open market. If you go into a bar in the American South and you are not anti-black, you're likely to get beaten up. But university, our ideal is that there's open debate. I've written a book that will be out in September. I think it's called In Defense of Free Speech, the University is a Censor. Emerald Press will publish it, which is interesting in that I had to go to Britain for a press rather than America. And what I have to say tonight will be mainly about America. I've not investigated the status of free speech in New Zealand universities. I do know that in women's studies here, I'm told by my students that everyone gets a fairly equal say. That is, you don't have to preach an ideological line or be shut up. I have no idea how Maori or Pacific Island conducts itself here. I have no information whatsoever. But in America, you have a creeping sort of censorship that comes from students themselves. Now, it's not all from students themselves. Some of it has to do with how the staff censor one another. And finally, there's, I think, the most pernicious effect of present-day university education, what the staff do to their own students. So let's take those three categories. I'll start first with talking a bit about Jeremy Waldron. Do any of you know who Jeremy Waldron is? Well, he was one of the most distinguished graduates that this university ever had. I think every paper he took, he got an A+ but one. And that, I think, was the mark of a pedant who should have given him an A+. And he would sometimes be given 10 questions to choose 3 and would write on all 10 and would still get an A+. So he's a very brilliant man, and he has written a book about hate speech. And he disagrees with me on certain points. For example, he says that many students who come to university in America today feel vulnerable. That is, they may be the first generation of blacks who went to university, the first generation of Hispanics. And he seems to approve at least some censorship by the administration of what can be said on campus. Well, I was one of the first of the generation of Irish Americans who went to university. And frankly, we didn't expect to be treated with kid gloves. I went to the University of Chicago because I expected to be challenged and to be upset by what I heard. I didn't want the university to cleanse itself of anything that might upset Irish Americans. In my own history of ethnic groups in America, I point out that Irish Americans had certain traits in 1900 that many people would think unlovely. That is, we came from Britain, we lived on farms where everyone grew only potatoes, and all you had to do that to stay alive. The farms would be about the size of this room. And if you ate enough potatoes a day, you could just stay alive. Well, all you do with potatoes is spade them over twice a year. That is, you don't learn any agricultural skills. And the Irish came to America, they were used to being outlaws because, of course, they were used to being rebels against the British Crown. They had very little educational capital. That is, under the penal laws, it was forbidden for a Catholic to be educated. You couldn't even send a Catholic abroad to be educated. So they came to America with a huge rate of alcoholism. That is, they grew potatoes, but you could make potato whiskey out of them. They came without any particularly good work habits. They were totally baffled by the huge cities in which they settled. They should have been in rural areas, but they had no rural skills. There was a heavy rate of domestic violence. That is, it said that there was as much domestic violence in Irish homes back at the turn of the century as you see in drug-infested homes today in America. Well, you know, should all this be covered up? I've been criticized for pointing these things out in print. I think Irish deserve to be aware of their history and deserve to be aware of how they climbed out of that particular hole and became achieving Americans. And when I went to the University of Chicago, I didn't face much anti-Irish prejudice, but I was amused to come to New Zealand to lecture in 1963 and found myself surrounded by anti-Irish jokes. You know, how many Irishmen does it take to change a light bulb? You know, 3, 1 to find the switch, 1 to find the bulb, and 1 to hold a chair, sort of stuff. And I never thought of Irish as being inherently stupid. But I heard this all the time, not just from students, but even from staff. And I thought, well, shows a certain ignorance. But well, I'm not here to get upset every time I hear the Irish maligned. I'm here to teach and to try and help students. Now, Jeremy Waldron, as I say, says, well, all right, Irish were insecure in the old days, but doesn't compare to what blacks and Hispanics feel today. That may be. They may be sensitive, though they have no right to be sensitive today. Virtually every university in America has what amounts to a black quota. That is, the blacks on the scholastic exams don't do as well as whites. And if they use the normal criteria for entry, places like Harvard would probably have only 1% blacks. So they have a quota. They fiddle it in a whole range of ways. They say we need athletes, and of course a lot of blacks are athletes. They say we need musicians, and a lot of blacks are good musicians. But it's really a fiddle to try and get a quota of about 5% or 10% of blacks at Harvard. And why any black in an American university today would feel insecure would mystify me. That is, they're certainly not discriminated against in the admissions office. If anything, in the admissions office, there's a pro-black bias. And they're certainly not likely to get turfed out. In university after university, there's speech codes. And many whites are expelled for violating the speech code, but I've yet to uncover even one case of a black being expelled because of the speech code. Either they control their speech more adequately than any group in history, or they never use anti-white epithets. That would seem to me absurd. I was once political action chairman for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in Chicago. And once blacks got to know you, they would often, with some affection, call you a honky or something of this sort. And I can't imagine that all black students at universities today never use a white stereotype and only suffer from black stereotypes. So there's no reason for them to feel insecure. And I argue against Walden that the most insecure minority in our civilization are people who seek the truth. At our university after university, if you try to seek the truth using the scientific method, and you try to refute unpopular opinions that people don't like, and you contain these in your courses, you're very likely to be turfed out. This is particularly true since a majority of the courses in America are taught by adjunct professors. That is, they try to save money. So now a majority of courses are taught by people who have no tenure whatsoever. Many of them have no prospect of tenure. They're poorly paid. And if they make one slip in a classroom, they're likely to be tossed out for disobeying the speech code. One guy, for example, referred to Mexican immigrants as wetbacks. Well, that comes from the fact that 30 years ago, when people talked about Mexicans, they were having to swim the Rio Grande because people wouldn't let them in. And it wasn't a term of racial abuse. It was actually a sympathetic term, saying, you know, most people seem to get into America, but The Mexicans have to be wetbacks. She was fired on that one student complaint. That was the end of it. One student went to the dean and said, I feel affronted by this, and out he went. And he said throughout all of his colleagues, they of course panicked. And they began to comb their courses for anything that might offend anybody. They say they could be let go at the drop of a hat. What if they discussed race and IQ? What if they discussed whether women were as intelligent as men? What if they discussed differential crime rates between America's ethnic groups? You know, the Irish had a much higher crime rate in 1900 than most Americans did. So they all went through their lectures and started censoring their lectures to see if there was anything that might offend anybody. The concept of a microaggression came in. These were statements that might not seem offensive, but might strike an unusual student as offensive. That is, if you discussed, for example, the prevalence of rape in certain groups, there might be a girl sitting in the class who had been raped, and therefore she would be terribly upset. So you then had to publish all of your lectures in advance and highlight things that might upset anybody. So you didn't just censor your lectures, but you had to avoid microaggressions, you had to do this. The Australian group of university women has now put out a list of microaggressions. Well, I can't imagine it'll ever be adopted because it's so ludicrous. Unknown to me, there are people who have a phobia that they might fall into a hole. And they're on the list. That is, you have to warn them. I don't know what the hell you'd warn them about. I presume you would warn them if you said there were holes in the sidewalk, but you have a microaggression from there. There are people who apparently are terrified of spiders. There are people who are terrified of worms. And so there's this enormous list of where you're supposed to look over your notes and make sure that you're not in danger of giving anyone a microaggression. So I will try to convince you that while I've been active in the race relations movement since an early time, that is, when I was young, I was preoccupied with the problem of ethical skepticism and what was really right and wrong. And I said to myself, well, if anything is wrong, racism is. You know, that's bedrock. And when I was a student, I was political action chairman for the NAACP. When I went south to teach in eastern Kentucky, I was chairman of CORE, was fired because of it and suffered some damage to my person. And I've always thought that racism is the ultimate evil. You know, it's absurd to think that people should be classified by skin color. In class, I often say, what would you think of a book reviewer who one day said a book was terrific because it had a white dust jacket, and said the next day the book was no good because it had come out with a black dust jacket? We would all say that this book reviewer had a very narrow estimate of how you assess human beings. So, and eventually I was tossed out of eastern Kentucky and was harassed while I was there. And I've always thought that racism is a great evil. But I have no compunction whatsoever discussing scholars who make what they think is an evidential case that there are genetic differences between races. And I'll tell you why I value such people. Are any of you familiar with Middlebury University? You are. Are you from Middlebury?
No, I'm from Grinnell College.
Oh, you're from Grinnell?
Yes.
Yes, I used to run cross-country against Grinnell at one time. That would have been back in the 50s. I remember Grinnell. They're in the Midwest Conference League.
Yes.
That's right. And did someone else have a hand up? Heard of Middlebury? Well, Charles Murray, who disagrees with me on most things, that is, he thinks, he never says this publicly, but I suspect he thinks there's a genetic gap between black and white for IQ. I've debated him twice. I know one of these debates is on the internet if you're interested in it. And he went to Middlebury not to speak on race. He went to Middlebury to speak on sociological trends that were causing Americans become more segregated in their lifestyle. You know, the rich living in gated communities surrounded by wire and guards, and the poor being effectively barred from these areas in one way or another. They wouldn't be able to buy any apartments there. They'd probably be too expensive. So he was going to speak on social segregation in America. But the students thought of him as a racist. And they thought of him as a racist because he published a book called The Bell Curve. I teach the bell curve at this university, and all of my students hopefully read it. Assuming they read, they probably would read it. And there are courses all over America taught about the bell curve that never assign the book. That is, all they assign is the critical literature about the bell curve. And students don't even get to read the book to test what's being said against the original. And when Murray went to Middlebury to speak, first when he entered the hall, students and perhaps some people from town raised such a terrible din that he couldn't be heard. And then he was moved to a sort of private place where I think he made a video of some sort that was broadcast around campus. And then when he tried to leave campus, his car was mobbed. People wanted to push it over and beat him up, and they managed to injure a woman who was one of his hosts on campus. Well, what can one say about these people? For what, there are universities now that there's a section of the library which has over it something like dangerous books. That is, they wouldn't actually burn Murray's book, but they would warn you that if you go into this section of the library, you might encounter books that would upset you. Now, let me just reflect a minute about this. I have read Murray, and I've read Jensen, who pioneered the notion that there was a genetic gap between black and white in modern terms. That, of course, goes back way, way back. But he's a modern scholar. And I've read Richard Flynn, who thinks that women are genetically inferior intelligence to men. And I profited enormously from trying to see why I thought they were right or wrong. I mean, you learn so much from refuting an opponent. And none of these kids at Middlebury, if the rioters are successful and the speech code is successful, will ever actually have to read and confront Jensen and Murray and Lynn. Now let me tell you briefly what I learned. Back in, I guess it would have been about 1980, I was writing a book that was only eventually published in 2000 about how you could defend humane ideals against their opponents. And I wanted to put in a chapter on racism because they're an obvious anti-humane opponent. And then I discovered Arthur Jensen, and I thought, this guy doesn't seem to be a racist. He says that every individual should be judged on their merits. But he says it is a legitimate question if you take black and white Americans as a group as to whether their gene frequencies are different and that whites more often will have high IQ genes and black more often lower IQ genes. Now, he always stuck to his point that you judge people as individuals. He said, even under my thesis, if black and white environments were equalized in America, 20% of whites would overlap with the upper 50%, of blacks would overlap with the upper 50% of whites. And he said the brightest person in America could be a black. But he thought on average there was a genetic difference, and I'll tell you why in a moment. But he pointed out, and I think he was quite right, that whenever you turn your back on the real world, you, of course, make a terrible concession that you can only believe in your ideals if you believe fictions. And he said, most of you people are dogmatic in terms of racial differences between groups, and there are consequences for this. And he imagined someone who was principal of a school in a nice neighborhood, and all the children were either the children of black professionals or white professionals. And yet there were more whites on the honor roll. And he said, if you dogmatically believe that the races are genetically equal, you'll want to pillory this principle. You'll say, however hard he tries to be even-handed, there must be some institutional racism hidden in the system. And he said it should be an open point as to whether black and white actually have, as a group, the same quality of genes for IQ. And the persecution of the principle is totally unfounded. He said, many of you seem to think that when there are quotas at Harvard, when black and white environments are equalized, then the problem will disappear. But he said, if there is an intelligence difference between the races statistically, even if you equalize environments, there'll still be a dearth of blacks that attend Harvard Law School. There'll be some, of course. The best applicant at Harvard Law School may be a black. And by the way, I got to meet Arthur Jensen, and I didn't detect in him any racism whatsoever. I'm quite convinced that if his daughter came home with a black fiance, he wouldn't turn a hair. And the reason he originally went into the IQ area was because students told him that black and Hispanic kids were being classified as mentally retarded, who seemed much more alert than the white kids that were being classified as mentally retarded. And he tried to investigate this and did some good. He said, well, they're being classified as mentally retarded, but they are only at a disadvantage in the school environment. In terms of everyday life, they seem to cope just as well as whites do. That didn't save him, of course, because he did admit that he thought there was a difference between the two groups in academic promise. Well, I looked at Jensen, and the first thing I noticed was very troubling, because most people who were naive, and I was naive then, think that the IQ difference between black and white is essentially a matter of socioeconomic status. That is, they say, well, blacks are poor. And if we only take blacks of high socioeconomic status and match them with whites of high socioeconomic status, the IQ gap will disappear. It doesn't. It's virtually untouched. There's the 15-point gap that prevailed at that time, affected blacks, whether they were working class blacks or doctors and lawyers. You found that, and that was pretty shattering to me. I didn't see any point in running away from it. I verified that it was true. And therefore, I had a problem. I had to ask myself, what's the significance of this? He also brought forward a two-step case, which was extremely convincing on its face. He said, when we do twin studies, we find that as twins mature, genes fundamentally dictate IQ and environment fades. Well, you can see what he meant by that. That is, you take two kids from a home, and you take them from another home, and initially family environment makes a big difference, doesn't it? But once they get to school, and once they get formal schooling, they tend to be treated more as equals. And therefore, the environmental differences tend to fade, and the genetic differences tend to assert themselves. And I developed a method in my last book with Cambridge in which I did an end run around the twin studies. And I developed a method from using Wechsler IQ tables to test this hypothesis. And I found he was right. That is, I used a new method, and it's a method I hope will catch on. And it did show that environment faded as kids got older, and genes seemed to be the major difference between their scholastic performance. Some things environment counted more than others, for example, vocabulary. Vocabulary differences in background didn't fade until your early 20s. And by that time, of course, you had to qualify for university, haven't you? That means you have to do well on the SAT verbal. And I could make a case that students from impoverished backgrounds were suffering an injustice in the sense that thanks to those backgrounds, they didn't get a fair shake at getting to a university. And there are certain things we can try to do about that. But he seemed to be correct. And he said, you know, if you're familiar with statistics, you're familiar with something called regression to the mean. And he says, the correlation between environment and IQ is at most 0.33. And he said, you're trying to use an environmental explanation of a 1 standard deviation IQ gap. To cite environment as its sole cause, you would have to say blacks are 3 standard deviation below white in environment. Some of you are science or math students. You're familiar with regression to the mean. You know, if you pick a group that is atypically tall, and the correlation is only 0.33, they'll regress 2/3 of the way towards the mean in terms of weight. And this is a powerful argument. And he said, look at this. And he said, are you going to tell me, you know, if you look at under the table of a normal curve, you'll find that for one group to be 3 standard deviations below another means that only 0.02% would be above or below the mean for the other group. And he said, are you going to tell me that there's only 0.02% of blacks in America that are better off than the average white environment? Are you going to tell me that only 0.02% of whites are worse off than the average white environment, or the average black environment? He said, you know, you have to have bums on Skid Row. You have to say that the black environment is as bad as homeless people in Chicago who sleep on the street to get down to the bottom 0.02 of 1%. Awful argument. And to just say, oh, Jensen is a racist. You know, we need not confront his data. We need not confront his arguments. Well, that wasn't my tendency. And I tried to, I think I have presented a case in my book, Race, IQ, and Jensen, and in my more recent publications, that he has exaggerated the feebleness of environment in terms of its effect on racial groups. First, what about the difference of the IQ gap? Well, I've shown in recent articles that within one generation recently, the IQ gap has gone down from 15 points to 10 points. And you'd have to be a very peculiar person to say that black and white are equal today. And I would say if you had true equality of environment, it might disappear. But even if it didn't disappear, it would certainly go down to a difference of less than 5 IQ points. And the IQ difference between twins and singletons is 4 points. And no one runs around getting hysterical about that. As we don't say, gee, there's a 4-point gap between singletons and twins, and therefore twins have to be looked at with abnormal scrutiny as to whether they're any good or not. So, and I am a scholar. You never know what the evidence will show in the future. But I think, on the basis of all the evidence thus far, that it is probable that blacks and whites have approximately the same genes for IQ. One of the things that interested me was I first studied in Germany, and he took the children of black and white servicemen. And as you can imagine, the occupation army in Germany left behind many illegitimate children. And he found out that the illegitimate children with German women that blacks had, they were no lower in IQ than the children left behind by whites. Well, that seems to mean, does it not, that genes didn't have much influence. Now, I had to spend a whole summer looking at the Army data because the Army used an IQ test to screen the races, and more blacks flunked that IQ test than whites. So you could argue that the blacks shouldn't have just eliminated the gap, they should have had a 3-point advantage. Well, a 3-point advantage is not really worth much, but I looked into this very carefully. And I was convinced by reading the testimony of people on the spot that although these half-black kids were not immersed in the American black subculture, they were dark-skinned Germans, there was a hell of a lot of racial prejudice in Germany that were fed on this, did he not? And further, if you were a half-black kid, it showed to other Germans that you had slept with the enemy, didn't it? Well, if you were a white kid, you could move to another town and you would escape that type of onus, wouldn't you? Over there.
Yeah, wasn't there a minimum bar you had to jump over to get to the army? Sorry. For getting into the army back then, was there not a minimum bar in terms of ability or IQ?
That's what I said. There was, and more blacks flunked it than whites. And I did the calculations and I thought, well, really, ideally, blacks would have done more than equal whites. They should have been 3 points above them to allow for that factor. And I don't think anyone has ever disputed my calculations. It took a hell of a long time. I had to get all of the Army IQ scores of all the blacks and whites in the European theater and compared them as to where the cutoff point seemed to be. And the black cutoff point was higher than the white. And when you did the maths, you'd have said, yeah, they should have been about 3 points better. But again, although they were not immersed in the American black subculture, the path that blacks faced in Germany wasn't quite as good as the path that whites faced. You know, there was some racial prejudice and there was the business of consorting with the enemy. And what can I say? But one of the things that was very interesting about the German data, and I was the first person to try this, Jensen in one of his supplementary arguments uses what he calls the method of correlated vectors. Do any of you know what the method of correlated vectors is? Well, it's really just a rank order correlation. What he did was he took 10 IQ tests and he ranked them in terms of how G-loaded they were. Now, I can't explain very quickly what G is, but many people in the IQ area, they analyze IQ tests and they try to calculate on a given test how much a superior person is above the average person. For example, in shoe tying, a person of superior intellect would probably not be far at all above the average person. And if you take an IQ test that's rote memory, then the person who is above that is a little above on overall IQ, but not a lot. But if you get to more complex mental operations, like Raven's progressive matrices, where you have to use logic on abstract shapes, then you find that the person who does well on that tends much more to do well on IQ as a whole. So it has what you call a high G loading. Well, the only cash value of G loading is that these tests are being ranked in terms of cognitive complexity. A good example of this is digit span forward and digit span backwards. Digit span forward is just a matter of rote memory. They read out digits at random and they see how many of them you can repeat back later. Digit span backward, you have to repeat the digits back in reverse order. So it's a more complicated mental operation, and lo and behold, it has a higher G loading. This digit span backward will predict your overall IQ better than digit span forward. And then he found that the black-white IQ gap got wider the more the test was cognitively complex. He said they're not so far behind whites for rote memory. But as you get up to things like Raven's progressive matrices and block design and object assembly, they start falling further and further behind. Now that, of course, was an argument you had to deal with. If I asked you to give an amateur definition of intelligence, you would probably say if a person is more intelligent than another person, that difference will show up more the more cognitively complex the problem. You know, if you compared Einstein with someone who was mentally retarded, I don't know that Einstein could tie his shoes any faster, because that has a very low loading and complexity, wouldn't it? But when you would get up to Raven's progressive matrices, he would open up a big gap, wouldn't he? So you had to confront this. But one of the things I did, I looked at I first data in Germany, and I found out that in Germany, this effect had totally disappeared. That is, there was no correlation between the complexity of the task and whether black or whites were different. Now this, of course, made me wonder whether this tendency on which Jensen relied so much wasn't a product of American black subculture. That is, there was no black American subculture in Germany, and the correlated vectors didn't seem to indicate anything. There is a black subculture in America, and there you find that the blacks do fall more and more behind whites the more cognitively complex the task. I also read a wonderful study by Elsie Moore. Now, Elsie Moore found 48 children, and 24 were adopted by black professional parents, and 24 were adopted by white professional parents. And in both cases, the mothers had 16 years of education. In both cases, the fathers were professionals. And she tested them. And at the age of 8.5, the black children adopted by white parents were 13 points ahead of the black children adopted by black parents. Now, there's no reason to believe that the whites, when the children were infant, had some radar where they picked out the intrinsically brighter children. Seemed to her, but also she did something very interesting. She called the black and white mothers in with their child to do cognitive tasks. And she found that the white mothers were universally good-humored and encouraging. They would say, well, that's interesting, why don't we try this? The black mothers were universally censorious. You're not that dumb. Can't you do better than that? And she said, she was, by the way, a black woman, and she said there was just a difference. That is, the black professional homes were much more impatient about solving cognitively complex problems with their children than the white homes were. The white mothers, when they confronted these problems with their child, they were much more cooperative, and with the black mothers, it was a source of antagonism between the child and the mother. So that is why I feel that you can put forward a hypothesis that there's not a genetic difference between black and white, that the IQ gap that shows up in America is partially a matter that black subculture is much less cognitively challenging than white subculture. Now that's not unusual. When I was an Irish kid, my father was over the moon if I made the track team, or showed up at sport. He would give me perfunctory praise if I had a top arithmetic score. In a Jewish home, if you came home and you made the rugby team, the first thing is, are you crazy? What if you get a head injury and can't get into medical school? There are just subcultural differences in terms of how much you are encouraged to develop cognitively complex skills as compared to other subcultures. Now, I'm attacked as a racist all the time for saying this. I'm blaming the victim. I'm saying black subculture is responsible for lack of black achievement. And what could be worse than to blame the victim? Well, of course, this is nuts. I mean, no individual is to blame for his subculture's history. I'm not to blame for the fact that the group I belong to in America and Ireland couldn't go to school, only spaded over potatoes, was drunk most of the time, and were outlaws. I mean, crazy stuff. I mean, I'm not responsible for that, but it has to be recognized. Why did Irish in America achieve so much less than Chinese Americans in the first generation? Well, Chinese Americans came to America. First, their farms were far more productive. The average Chinese farm was 3 times the size of the average Irish farm. They not only marketed a surplus of crops and were engaged in the money economy, but they grew silk. They had a vibrant educational tradition, the Mandarin system. If a kid from your town became a Mandarin, he would favor your town in a whole range of ways. They were essentially sober. That is, you found very few Chinese alcoholics. Have you ever walked into a Chinese restaurant, as I have in New Zealand and America, and you see a little Chinese kid asleep over his books, and then he pops up and he picks up the book? You don't usually see that in an Irish restaurant. You don't see a kid studying away on their books who immediately, when he wakes up, goes back to the book again. In Chinese homes in America, older kids help younger kids. The kids settle down to homework immediately. I once saw an interesting study in which, in a Chinese professional household, the children started their homework with the help of their others. In a Jewish household, there was a lot of screaming, and then the kids started their homework. In a black hospital home, when the kid started doing his homework, the father would say, why don't we go out behind the garage and shoot a few baskets? So there are cultural differences of this sort between groups in terms of welcoming cognitive challenge. Look at all that I learned from studying Censor. I learned infinitely more about the black experience in America and about statistics and about cultural comparisons than if I had just run him off campus and said, oh, no, this is too racist to listen to. I'm not going to try to hear your arguments and refute them at all. Richard Flynn put forward a hypothesis for a racial hierarchy. He said East Asians are intrinsically the brightest, then whites, then blacks. And he had all sorts of data to this effect. And the data was mainly that, as you can see, Asians do better at school than most whites do. And he said, how can you call me a racist? I'm white. I'm saying that my group is only second on the pecking order, you know. And look at all this evidence of how well Chinese kids do at school compared to white kids, and look at how badly black kids do. And he borrowed from a guy named Rushton. Have any of you heard of Philip Rushton? Well, Rushton had a far more obnoxious hierarchy than Jensen. He claimed that blacks on average were not only inferior for intelligence, but they lacked self-control, which is why they more often were guilty of rape. They lacked self-control, which meant that they tended more often to be criminal. And I've collected a lot of data trying to show that this is a simplified typology. But Lynn had a reason for it. He said when the human race came out of Africa, the blacks, of course, stayed in Africa and were in a relatively benign environment. Well, the originally blacks that came out, some went north of the Alps during the Ice Ages, that is, the ones who became Europeans, and some of them went north of the Himalayas, which was even colder during the Ice Ages. So the blacks had a benign environment, and the whites had a middling environment north of the Alps, and the East Asians had a really rigorous environment north of the Himalayas. And he said this, of course, made a difference in natural selection. You had to be much more imaginative to hunt the Arctic fox if you're an East Asian than you did to just have a banana drop in your lap if you were a black. Now, of course, all of this was supposition. I could write a different evolutionary scenario. But again, people said racism, racism. Well, I got interested in this, and I got a hold of Chinese geneticists, and I found that the Chinese are really two groups. One is a group that came out of Africa along the coast of India and Indochina, and never did during their evolutionary history have extreme cold. And another group may well have come from the Tibetan Plateau where they did. So you would predict, wouldn't you, that the IQs of North Chinese would be higher than the IQs of South Chinese? Not at all. It's totally uniform. It made no difference whether they were north of the Himalayas or sitting around, on the coast of India. Now that doesn't show, of course, that there's no evolutionary scenario you can put forward. But it was very interesting to me to learn that about China and to learn something about the history of Chinese. Flynn also said that women were genetically inferior for IQ to men. And he had a powerful body of data. He had data from universities all over the world. And almost uniformly, they showed that university men had an IQ about 3 or 4 points higher than university women. And I looked at this stuff and I said, for God's sake, these are not equivalent samples. All you have to do is to go to any secondary school in the Western world, and you find that more boys are expelled, more have discipline problems, more don't hand in their homework. The girls are much more docile. The honor roll is loaded with girls. A girl with an IQ of 100 thinks of herself as university material because she's got A's and B's. The boy has B's and C's and is much more likely to qualify. And then I got a hold of Lynn's data, and I found that the threshold for girls going to university was about 100, but the threshold for boys was about 104. So of course the boys had a higher IQ at university. They were a more highly selected group. You had to have 104 to get into university in America if you were a boy, but only about 100 if you were a girl. So you had a much, more representative sample of women, didn't you? And I also got me interested in why the hell this was going on. And it introduced me to all the literature that shows that there's a crisis in the Western world as to how boys are interfacing with secondary school education. What the hell is behind all this? And there are many theories about this, but there's no doubt that what's happening If you look at the American achievement tests that are given at the 12th grade to 17-year-olds, and you look at reading, you find that the girls' average is at the 67th percentile of boys. That is, only the top third of boys duplicate the top half of girls. You find that for writing, the average girl is at the 75th percentile for boys. So for written skills, it's even worse. Well, this opens up an interesting problem, doesn't it? What the hell is going on here? And I found other data pointing out that in Norway, when young men report for the draft, they have been no IQ gains over time. But if you take earlier age groups, before they have interfaced differently with secondary school, there are IQ gains. That is that I'm known for the Flynn effect, having discovered massive IQ gains over time. And as we go into the 20th century, these are beginning to disappear. And I pointed out they're only disappearing for certain age groups. That is, boys aren't making any progress. In other words, the secondary school environment of boys is probably deteriorating. Well, for other age groups, it's still perhaps, better or getting better. Over here.
When do the IQ gains slow down exactly?
It depends where you are. This is another thing that always drives me wild. American gains are still going. It's only mainly in Scandinavia that they seem to have reversed. Now, why is that? Holland is typical. In Holland, the aged are still making huge gains because compared to the last generation of adults, we're much nicer to old people. We take them to places to do puzzles. More of them are well-fed and get medical care. So in Holland, you have IQ gains zooping along for the aged. For preschoolers, they're dead stopped. I think that preschoolers, the parents have run out of educational toys. They've enriched the environment about as much as they know how to do. In New York, for example, there was an IQ test for children where you saw at the age of 6 months whether they responded to a bell. And my impression was that New Yorkers started driving their children insane by ringing bells at them all day. So I think they've run out of educational toys, and at that level it's static. You find out in primary school there seems to be still some IQ gains, but not at secondary school or young adults. And you find for people in the world of work there are still IQ gains, which I think means that in Scandinavia the jobs are still becoming a little more intellectually challenging when you go out into the world of work. That wouldn't be true in a country that was creating a lot of mindless service jobs. So when you look at this literature, you say, IQ gains are not like the law of gravity. They're not something written in the heavens. They're a result of sociological trends. And these vary from country to country, and they even vary from age group to age group.
If I might weigh in for a moment,
Pardon?
I'm currently on placement at an all-boys school, and it's really interesting conversing with the people who are placed at mixed or all-girls. The ones at the all-girls get to do their lesson plans all at once in advance. I do mine the day before because I never know when the boys are going to metaphorically throw a chair out the window, or literally. That hasn't happened yet, but they've done similar things.
Yes, so you're running into something of the same problem, that there's a differential between the sexes here. At university, girls still get higher grades because although they're of slightly lower IQ, their character structure still interfaces with university education better. That is, even though the girls have a slight IQ deficit in terms of actually getting A's and B's. In my class, I always chide them, Psych 204. I have only about 1/3 boys, and I say I will predict that the late essays will come more often from boys than girls. I've never been proved wrong yet.
I just want to chime in and point out that in the U.S., currently in today's society, almost 60% of university graduates are women.
Yes, that's right. And you find a reversal in medical school, too. When I was young, the medical school graduates were very heavily male. And now you have almost everywhere more females. And there is no doubt something has happened. It's not that girls are intrinsically brighter. something has happened to the sexes in formal education. And as I say, to run away from someone like Richard Lynn would have meant I would never begin to explore this problem. You know, I thought, well, I want to find evidence about Lynn, and it opens up all sorts of new avenues for you. Now, at university, let me say this. I've talked about how censors, student censors, prevent us from looking at fundamental problems because I don't know, are they afraid we're all going to find that blacks really are inferior? You know, are they traumatized by fear that that is true? I would still say that you have to look at any empirical hypothesis evidentially. And I'm glad I've looked at the hypothesis evidentially. And I'm now convinced that probably the two races are about equal. But if there is a differential that's too small for anyone to get hysterical about, we should look at the black environment and see what's the hell's the matter with it. Now, Richard Lynn also said that black women tend to be more psychopathic than white women. He gave them the Minnesota multiphasic. Does anyone know what that is? It's a personality test. And one of the things that make you more likely to be psychotic is that you have a negative view of marriage. Well, I looked into this and I found that for every 100 white women of marriageable age, there are about 90 men who would be suitable partners. While for every 100 black women of marriageable age, there are about 57. The rest are in jail, or are dead, or on drugs. Indeed, there is a large proportion of black men who are non-people, who have just disappeared in American society, and they're not in the army, they're not in the census, we don't know what the hell happened to them. I mean, they can't all be at the bottom of Lake Michigan with concrete on their feet. So there are 1 million black men in America that are non-people. And I said to Richard Lynn, well, what if your daughter, rather than being white, was black? And had to face a black marriage market where there are only 57 viable men for 100 women. Don't you think that they would have a more negative view of marriage? I'm surprised that their view isn't even more negative. A lot of them must be romantics because their chances of meeting a suitable male, and of course, therefore, they have a higher illegitimacy rate. When I was active back at the yards with Saul Alinsky, you'd go to a black girl's home, and I'd say, Nancy, you're pregnant again, you're only 18, do you really want a third child? And she would say, I flunked out of school, black men don't consider me desirable, white men don't marry black women, and the only people who have ever loved me are my children. You know, she said the partners that my mother had who came in were brutal. I felt angry at my mother for not protecting me. You know, you have this image of all these black women victimizing the system and choosing to become welfare mothers. You'd have to be insane to think that that was a good strategy to have an affluent life. And she would live in a high-rise apartment 12 blocks from Lake Michigan and had never seen the lake. That is, she was totally segregated in terms of adult contacts. So, as I say, this is the sort of thing you learn if you look. If you just sit around and say, I'm not going to pay any attention to Richard Lynn, he must be wrong because the races are equal. Well, the races aren't equal, of course. You know, they're different in environment, and they're probably genetic differences. I'm convinced that women have a little more trouble on average with spatial visualization. That is, the one IQ test where you have trouble eliminating a gender difference is where you have one of these pieces of paper and you punch holes in it. You know, it's folded over. And you punch holes in it and you have to predict where the holes will be when the paper is unfolded. Men tend to do better on that than women. And it's very difficult to eliminate that difference. They do a little worse on predicting what shapes will look like rotated in space. Well, so what? You know, they're not all going to be guides in the outback taking people to hunt bears. They're not all going to be London taxi drivers who have to have a perfect image of the city. You know, it's not terribly important, but I suspect there is some difference there. It's very hard to eliminate it. difference. Well, women tend to do a little better on vocabulary and verbalizing. So I'm sure there are genetic differences, but only when you look into these things do you learn anything. Now, the other thing that disturbs me about universities is the tendency for certain departments to become ideological rags. You find this is true of most Black Studies departments in America, and you find it's true of a lot of women's studies departments, though less so. But there are also subtler differences. Even in New Zealand, I suspect, from soundings, it's almost impossible to find an education department that takes IQ seriously. You see, it ranks people. And if there's anything educators hate, it's anything that ranks people. You know, everyone ought to be the same. And you find people just can't argue for IQ in an education department without being pilloried. In psychology departments, I did a survey, and most departments there was no course on intelligence. Do you know why? Some kid in back would put up his hand and say, what about the black-white IQ gap? And then if the lecturer said, well, it's genetic, he'd be lynched on the spot. If he said it's cultural, he'd be acclaimed of blaming the victim. That is, no answer would be appropriate. So in 90% of American psych departments, kids are miseducated. That is, no course will be offered at the undergraduate level on intelligence because it's considered too hot to handle. You also have a very worrying trend. I found that one of the offshoots of IQ gains over time was that young people were much less likely to be sexist or racist. They were much more used to universalizing their moral principles. My father was mildly racist, but he wasn't very anti-black because he hated Englishmen so much that took up his energy. It was like a garden hose. And when my brother and I came back from university at the time of Martin Luther King, we would say to my father, well, what if you woke up tomorrow morning and were black? And he would say, that's the dumbest thing you've ever said. Who do you know has ever turned black overnight? That is, his principles were inherited. He had inherited a bias against blacks, and he was unwilling to subject it to logical analysis. And thanks to IQ gains over time, young people are much more likely to be anti-racist. But of course, ignorance will cripple you. You can have very good values, and if you're ignorant, you will still make a lot of mistakes. And the best way to stay ignorant is not to argue with your opponents. And there are some dreadful tendencies among students. I've been lecturing now for over 60 years. And every decade, I find fewer students are reading. Fewer of them are reading serious literature, fewer of them are reading history. And this is borne out by surveys in America. Down, down, down. If anyone had told me that during my career, the number of university graduates would double and the amount of reading would decline, I would say you're mad.
Was it, I was reading a history book, and it was a life in the American colonies, and when it first started getting up, and at first there was no labour shortage, and so the people had to start to farm their farms.
Sure.
And then once there was a huge labour shortage,
Yeah.
they started
You needed an
slaves.
educated workforce.
And then I think they were running out of land to give because there's still the natives pushing back and stuff. So they're running out of land, and the rich wanted to find a scapegoat for the poor to blame. And so I think that's maybe where an aspect of racism came from. Was
So there was every hope by the rich to split the working class. And it was a godsend that you could get the white working class to hate the black working class. I mean, that was a split that made it difficult to unionize the South for generations. If you're interested, I'll talk to you about that afterwards, because I taught in the South and I know something about it. But what I'm getting at is this: there's a terrible tendency in university education for it to become purely vocational. Almost all of the universities say they will train you in critical intelligence. They don't. They don't give you a knowledge of history and literature and philosophy that you really need to be critically intelligent. I was amused by interviews that are done with current students. And they'll say, do you feel able to criticize your government? And they'll say, well, I sort of feel things would be better if there were fewer wars, but I really don't know much about it. That is, however bright you are, if you're colossally ignorant, you're not going to be a social critic. And there's also been a tendency for universities to make a hedonic pact. That is, 50 years ago, the average student read 24 hours a week. Now it's 8 hours. They don't even read their assigned course materials. They demand a course book. And they won't read the readings for a course. They'll just memorize passages out of the course book. And, what sort of education is this? And as I say, there's a sort of hedonic pact. Most of these lecturers are adjunct professors and are liable to be fired at any moment. And they want good student surveys, don't they? Yeah. And so there's the lecturer says to himself, well, I'll make it easy for them if they'll make it easy for me. I won't set rigorous requirements. I won't change the exam every year. I'll signal to them that all they have to do is look at last year's exam, memorize 4 chunks of the course book, and they're on their way. So it's beneficial to both sides. You don't have to invest any time in reading of history or literature of your course. Now, this isn't true in physics and maths, of course. There you've got to actually learn to solve the problems. Yeah, I'm talking about humanities and social science. And when you interview the kids, they say it. They say, don't take this course. You have to work too hard for an A. Take this course. Everyone gets an A or a B by showing up. And over here.
Why is that? Why is it that the maths, the physics has maintained this high standard, this rigor, but in the social sciences and and in history, you've seen this plummeting of objective standards?
Well, I think it's because it's very embarrassing to a university to send its students to graduate school, let's say at Wisconsin or Harvard, and they can't do the problems. They can't do differential equations. While you can certainly educate someone in law, pre-law, and they learn how to do torts and conveyancing, but they're utterly ignorant about everything else. And as I say, despite the fact that the education has become narrower and narrower, what test is there? You see, one of the groups, it's not just Black Studies departments that are ideologically motivated. You'll never find a Black Studies department that actually has a reading list with conservative blacks on it. They're forbidden.
Like Thomas Sowell.
Thomas Sowell is a friend of mine. You'll never find Thomas Sowell on one of those reading lists.
I love his talk.
Yes,
Sorry.
but you learn a lot. I don't agree with Thomas. He's right-wing and I'm left-wing, and he feels that when he takes power, I'll have to be exterminated, but we can be friends in the meantime. And his books are very interesting, but they just don't appear. They're not there. And you don't find people who call feminist claims into question there either. Well, look, I'm running out of time. I want you to be free to ask questions. But there is a sad tendency in universities. That is, there's a tendency for students to want to censor staff who undertake unpopular research. You have microaggressions and staff are fired. You have department after department who are too frightened to assign authors that are considered unpopular. You have libraries where you have a warning that if you read books in this area, it may upset you. And you have, of course, the public suffers. I mean, teacher training is ideologically loaded.
Hell yeah, it is.
I
hate it.
It's just unbelievable. They're taught to send teachers out in the schools, and the only thing that's important is sort of imitating an anarchist commune. It's not important to actually learn anything. And so a lot of damage is done to the larger society. Well, I'll summarize at that point. That is, I say, that the 4 things that have upset me most, I, by the way, on the left was politically censored during the McCarthy period. I was fired from one of my jobs because I was a socialist. And it pains me, now that the left wing is in control of universities, that they're trying to freeze the conservatives out. They're making the same sort of censorship mistake that afflicted my generation. I mean, I and my friends suffered a great deal of persecution because our views were considered unorthodox. It upsets me that so much of the university is vocational. It upsets me that students don't read anymore. And it upsets me the hedonic pact that this university is turning much more into a sort of back-scratching operation, where if you're nice to the lecturers, they'll be nice to you. Well, that's it, and I'll take questions. Over here.
I would like
Where
to
did you
know-
say you were from again?
Oh, Grinnell College.
Grinnell, yes.
Yeah.
How's Grinnell doing? Is it failing financially, or is it okay?
Well, given that our endowment is over $1 billion, that's
Oh, well, you're okay
we're
then.
doing pretty good. However, a physics professor was fired last year for perceived aggressions against women in the department. So I would say that in terms of
What did he do?
limiting, well, in class he was said to not listen to students who were female who were in lab, and
He would ignore their questions.
Yes.
Well, I guess that's possible. I'm very suspicious.
I am suspicious as well.
Yeah,
I go to the
because
college.
it's really, you'd have to be almost a nut to do that, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Usually a lecturer wants people to ask questions. It makes the class come alive.
Mhm.
And that he would systematically, discriminate against women seems about as plausible as that he would systematically discriminate against redheads. But I guess you could find a lunatic of that sort, but it doesn't seem very probable.
I don't think so, given that the hiring process is very rigorous, in addition to the fact that the students at my college are extremely sensitive to issues of this nature. And so I think that it was just something that was blown up. But that wasn't actually a question.
Sure.
My question was, you used the IQ test a lot in terms of the research that you've studied and
Yes, that's right. In psychology, I'm primarily a
Yes.
philosopher, so the psychology is a sort of add-on.
Hmm.
But in my psychology research, I have studied a lot about IQ.
And I just wanted to know, given that these problems that you ask people to solve are a lot of it's focused on reading and writing.
Yes, you need those at university. You see, IQ tests aren't culturally benign.
Okay.
They wouldn't be any use if they were. I mean, who wants an IQ test that predicts how well you would do if you were in traditional Aboriginal society in Australia?
Yeah.
The IQ test you would want there would be map reading and memory and quickness of perception. To survive in the outback, you better have good map reading skills. You'd better very quickly note, let's say, that there are birds over an area, so there might be game there. You certainly wouldn't need to have highly complex problem-solving skills or a big vocabulary.
Mm.
Well, in America, IQ tests run in this direction, and people say they're not culturally relative, and I said, of course they're not. They're meant to predict how you would do on those cognitive skills that are emphasized in a highly industrial culture. And again, if we were training all London cab drivers, maybe we should have a map reading test on IQ tests. But what you're trying to find out is, do these tests predict who, when they go to university, will be able to read Steinbeck? And do they predict who will be able to do elementary calculus? They're really tests that predict academic achievement. But academic achievement is the main avenue of upward social mobility in our society. You certainly don't, want them to predict who will be the best Kalahari bushman. I mean, that's not something that's very important.
That's just cited as the main limitation of IQ tests, and so a lot of the argument against IQ tests in today's classrooms is just that they only test academic achievement and not really a lot of other things.
Well, let's say that's true. If they're predictive, they're predictive. You see, what they try to do is to test your potential for achievement by eliminating things that actually you may be at a disadvantage for because of your background. For example, they don't test for esoteric words on the vocabulary test. They test for mainstream vocabulary, because you don't just want to have a word that 1 people in a million recognize. On the arithmetic test, they mainly test, interestingly enough, for whether you can still do mental arithmetic. Apparently this seems a better predictor on a low level of how you do later on than if you're not adept at that. So that their function is to say, look at Raven's progressive matrices. Do you know anything about it? Well, it uses very simple shapes and asks you to see logical connections between them. They might have triangles and circles, and they're in a 9-point pattern. And you're asked to see a pattern there, and you may find that there are 3 triangles on a diagonal, and that would give you the right answer. And that is meant, of course, to try and free aptitude for learning. Because I think almost anyone knows what circles and triangles are. And this is pretty much a pure test of logical inference.
I mean, that would go under the assumption there was, I heard of a study, I haven't read it myself, but they were looking at, I think it was people that were like, I think they were Aboriginal or they were natives that lived in jungle, and they couldn't recognize
Exactly. And
parallel lines.
I've got a whole chapter on this, the Raven's Revolution. And I pointed out that these things that they think are so easily recognizable by pre-industrial peoples aren't at all. That in point of fact, Ravens is actually, I was giving as an example of what they're trying to do. Ravens doesn't succeed very well. And my data, it shows that IQ gains in America on Raven's progressive matrices have been 50 IQ points in 100 years. Well, how can you claim that that test isn't subject to cultural evolution? Obviously, I have a whole theory of intelligence based on this, that in point of fact, in our society, even compared to what we were like in 1900, we are much more likely to be interested in using logic on obstructions. There's a wonderful psychologist called Luria, and he interviewed Russians in rural Russia who had only minimal education. And he would say to them, there are no camels in Germany. And he would say, Hamburg is a city in Germany, are there camels there? And they would say, I've never visited Hamburg, but perhaps it's too small a city to have room for camels. That is, they were quite unwilling to use logic on abstract premises. It was important to them whether there were camels. Or they had another group which said, where the background is always white, bears are white. A man comes to you from the North Pole. What was he likely to say about the bears? And they would say, well, if he was worthy, if he was an honest person, and you could trust him, you might then take his word for it, but you really want to see. And they had another question, what do fish and crows have in common? And these people said, absolutely nothing. You're supposed to say that they're animals, And they said, nothing at all. You can eat a fish, you can't eat a crow. A crow can peck at a fish can't jump up in the air and catch a crow. In other words, they were pragmatically oriented. Their minds were totally focused on concrete reality. And they had no use for educational skills of the sort used on ravens.
So like the question and the answer and then...
Yes, that's right. They didn't have the habits of mind, as I call them. We have different habits of mind than people. They did a wonderful test in Ohio. That is, they compared the questions that Ohio students had to answer in 1910 with 1990. And they found that all of the stuff in 1910 was socially valued information. How many states are there in America? Where do you get dairy products from? The tests in 1990 were things like, the largest city in a state is rarely the capital. Why is that? And you had to think now, the legislators are controlled by rural people. They hate the big city. So they never make New York the capital, they make Albany. They never make Los Angeles the capital, they make Sacramento. They never make Philadelphia the capital, they make Harrisburg, you see. So you had to put concepts together to do well. So even within schools, they reflect this. They're not testing people that are totally wedded to the concrete world. I suspect that my grandmother had a better memory than I do, because she wanted to remember all of her relatives to the 3rd degree of cousins and kindred and God knows what. But I know that my father who went into factory work when he was 10 or 11. He didn't have much use for this type of abstract theorizing. He was a factory worker. You know, he went into a bed spring factory. And you focused on what was important. You're focused on how much you hated the rich, for example, that they would lock you out if you voted left and things of that sort. But he had a huge vocabulary because he was a self-educated man. But there's been a change in mental habits since 1900. And it proves that Ravens is really very culturally sensitive in a way they didn't suspect.
I just want to ask, do you think that maybe the issue of the sort of like ideological departments and studies could be due to the methods that are employed, that basically scientific method isn't really the sort of the key?
Yes, well, that's quite right. If you look at these departments, very little worthwhile scientific research comes out of them. What come out of them are missionaries. There are people who are convinced that America should look a certain way and are determined to bring it about. I happen to be more of a traditionalist in education. I think it's fairly important whether kids can read and calculate, and much less important whether they never rank each other. But and then in Black studies, of course, who is going to be the most militant? The most militant will be someone who says blacks will never have a home in America, revolution is the only answer. Well, the conservative blacks tend to be assimilationists. They say, well, Italians eventually became Americans and no different than anyone else, why not us? But you can imagine which group appeals to the students more, the romance of the revolution. And so they just freeze out all contrary opinions. And the same thing happens in Women's Studies department. There's a wonderful book on this subject, and in one Women's Studies class, she said, all lesbians sit on the right, and all straight women sit on the left. And she said, I hope by the end of this course you're all sitting on the right. What are you to say about such a course? Men who attended the course were put sitting in the aisles and were talked over to show how women felt when men ignored them. And if you spoke up as a man in such a class, you were almost always pillory. There was a very funny joke one woman told. She remembered Monty Python. Do you know who Monty Python is?
Yeah.
And you remember once there was a group of people who were being examined in one of these quiz things. And no matter what question was asked, the right answer was pork. And she said, no matter what question is asked in our women's studies class, the right answer is that men did it. You know, if agriculture looks bad, it was designed by men. If this is bad, the origin had to be in men. She said it rather put her off, progressing in that class. Well, I know I, by the way, am quite alert still, but I don't want you. Do you want to sort of adjourn and people just gather around me who still have questions? I don't want to keep you from your tea.
We can do a couple more questions and then we can wrap up.
Pardon?
A couple more questions and then we'll wrap up.
Okay. Yeah, one more question. Over there is a question from one of my students. That's good.
So last year you went on the news to talk about the two Canadian speakers who came down, and you said that the people shouldn't listen to them because they're not interested in contributing or anything to debate.
I said that what's the harm of having them? If you don't like them, don't go and hear them.
Yeah.
You know, I don't understand what this is all about. Let's imagine that a real racist came on campus. Well, are our students so intellectually bankrupt that they can't reject the message of this person? Just ignore them. Or if you want to, hire a hall across the street and give a contrary point of view. That is, what all students proved when they chased Charles Murray off campus was that they were more powerful than he was. That is, they applied the principle of might makes right. Well, that's a very bad principle for seeking the truth. However defective open debate is, and however many mistakes we make, we are going to make fewer mistakes than a self-appointed censor who knows what has to be true and won't listen to anyone else. You know, these people are, that's why I say that people who really seek the truth are the most vulnerable minority. And university after university across America people who have a genuine interest in treating empirical problems as empirical, they are the most vulnerable.
How familiar are you with the Teachers College department here?
Here, I don't know much about it. I did know Val Maxwell once. He taught at the Teachers College.
I have no idea, he's probably not here anymore.
He's not here anymore. And he said to me, you know, I went out on section, and there was a Maori girl in a one-room school. She was doing a brilliant job on reading and stuff, but the kids didn't know any arithmetic. And he came back 6 months later and he said to her, oh, they still don't know any arithmetic. And she said, she burst into tears and said, I can't do arithmetic. Well, this, of course, is the result, is it not, of affirmative action. You push. If a Maori kid goes to training college, he felt they were pushed through, you know, without regard as to whether they were really competent as a teacher. Now, that's just one piece of anecdotal evidence. That's all I know about the Teachers College, and I would never suggest judging it on one case alone. But there is a tendency in most places. I mean, in America, one of the reasons that standards have collapsed so much is that very few people are so derelict as to give black and white students different marks. So you pass everyone. Then there's no difference in failure rates, is there? The failure rates are equal.
It's actually touched on something, and my thoughts not fully formed on this, but it was how passing people like that, you get short-term gains, but it hurts your own university in the long term. This has just been putting a
It does unless all the others are doing it.
Yeah, and then in what case you might end up with, I think, what's happening in America at the moment, where you've got, it's almost a degree arms race, where everybody's got the same degree now because they're just doing away with objective standards.
Well, the rationalization at Harvard is that our standards are so high, if you get into Harvard, you couldn't possibly fail. So you see, however badly you perform, you know, unless you are, you know, confined to a madhouse or something, you can fail that way. But they will give the Harvard graduate, and they're bright kids, they can often learn quite a bit without really trying. So you say, what are we going to do? Are we going to give Harvard kids C's when Princeton is giving them A's and B's? Do you know how much a Harvard education costs? Do you think we want parents in the office saying, I've spent 100,000 years and you're going to flunk my kid out? I actually donated a doorknob to the local gymnasium. And so you do, what you say is true. Harvard would not want to be ranked with Southern Illinois. But it depends on its entrance standards as a way of showing what an elevated place it is. Once you get in, if you even show the minimum effort, you're likely to stay in. And that seems to be pretty universal. I looked at Ivy Leagues, and you know, there was one place, I think it was, I'm trying to remember if it was Princeton, that found that the average mark they were giving was an A-. You know, that was their average mark. And if you ask them, well, if you get into Princeton, you're bright. And what if we give lower grades than Harvard? Okay, well, I'm happy to stick around and chat with people.
Okay, well, can everyone give another round of applause?
I like wine. I don't have to drink it now.
You don't.
Okay, well, people who want to come up front, I'm happy to stay in my classes. I do class. I'm going to stick around for half an hour.
I recommend everything.